may remember me from my television shows in the 1980s and 90s, and now I host two regularly live-streamed virtual magic shows. One is a showcase for some of the greatest magicians in the world, and the other is a talk show featuring some of the most inspiring conjurers of our times. Welcome now to Magical People. And welcome everybody to this week's edition of Magical People Live. My very special guest this week is Carlina de la Cova. Carlina is a forensic anthropologist slash bioarchaeologist with a minor in medicine, and we're going to find out how that all figures in her life. But first, I want to acknowledge the fact that you're a regular. You and your fella Al Shaw are both magicians as well, and you often join the Open Mic Magic Theater, usually as observers. By the way, look that up on Facebook, and occasionally this show and my other show as well. I want to introduce you by way of a little video that you provided to me. It's actually a news clip, what I call a television news clip. So everybody, it's not too long. Have a look at this.
And professors at a local university help sheriff's deputies solve missing persons cases. How they're able to do it, coming up. Tuesday, a surveyor crew found the remains of an 84-year-old man behind a home on High Cone Road. Now, crews figured out the remains were those of Henry Wilson. He disappeared in 2004, actually December 2004. But you may not know that a local university played a part in helping investigators identify the body. WFMY News 2's Justin Quisenberry spoke with an anthropologist from UNC Greensboro today. And Justin, how did she help?
Well, Frank, the professor and her team of 3 other people were able to take a look at the bones and determine approximate age, gender, even race, and that helped investigators narrow down their list of missing person cases.
Every bone tells a story. Every skeleton has a story to tell. And the key is looking at that skeleton and hearing what that skeleton says.
Anthropologist Carlina de la Cova was able to look at a skeleton found this week and determine key characteristics of the person's identity.
They've managed to narrow down their idea on who the individual may have been based on the information that I was able to provide for them.
She's able to look at a skull,
These little squiggly lines,
which helps determine age.
we know that these fuse at certain times.
Evidence of age is also found in the pelvis.
In younger individuals, you tend to see more ridging, and whereas in older individuals, you get more erosion.
The shape of the eyes and nose point to ancestry.
In the African here, you can see that it's wider. You can see that the nasal bones are shorter.
The remains found this week showed signs of arthritis, visible by a rigidness on the spine. It was key evidence, even though a Medicaid card was found in a coat pocket identifying the person as Henry Wilson.
The concern is whether or not someone has stolen someone's ID.
She was able to determine the key characteristics within 3 hours.
Because everybody, regardless of who they are and whatever context they come to us in, everybody had somebody that loved them. And it's giving those individuals that peace. And that's what really drives me to do this, and that's why I enjoy it.
The identification is still preliminary. A positive identification will be made by DNA, and that testing will happen in Texas and could take a few months. Frank?
Very interesting, Justin. Thanks. The remains were scheduled to be sent to the medical examiner's office in Chapel Hill today for further testing.
So what you do is so crucial, Carlina. It's not just what we see on TV or used to see with the CSI folks, and all of a sudden DNA evidence has been processed in a day or a couple of days. I seem to remember some of the people on CSI working with skulls and skeletons, etc. But you do the real thing, and it doesn't take minutes. It doesn't take 60 minutes or the length of the show to have everything solved. So let's chat a little bit about that it's much more than that.
It's a longer process, and that was actually my first case working solo out of graduate school, relatively fresh. I was relatively new to Greensboro at that point in time, which is where this took place. I was teaching at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro, and I had been working with law enforcement for maybe about a year and a half. In fact, I saw my favorite detective in that real George Moore and got a little verklempt. But it does not, and this case was a lucky case. Even 3 hours, like they said, that rarely happens. Usually it's a much longer process, and it can take days to even weeks to even months. It depends on the condition we find the individual in. It depends on the artifacts or the clothing and evidence we find with the individual. And then if we do send things out for DNA testing, that takes months, sometimes years, depending upon the backlog in your state labs or whether or not it's going to be sent out to the FBI lab for analysis. This case was very emotional in the sense that we had an individual who was not too far from the door of a home that hadn't been inhabited in a while. And a surveyor was going out. I can't remember if it was a surveyor or realtor was going out to walk the property, check the property, and it was clear that he had found the skull of this individual because the skull we found in a different place away from the rest of the body. But Mr. Wilson was still clothed, for the most part, from his chest up. His pants were actually, half of his body was found on one side of the fence, the other half was found on another side of a sort of makeshift country fence, if you will. So we were able to ascertain what possibly happened to him. And because he had his ID, we found his ID in a relatively short period of time. But the law enforcement agents there on site wanted to make sure that this was this individual. And so when I was called in to basically recover Mr. Wilson, not analyze him. But this is what happens in the real world of forensics. When you have a county that relies on another county, a much larger county that oversees other counties for the identification of individuals, and they may not have a forensic anthropologist on staff. So my detectives, my guys asked me if I could identify this individual in the field before this individual was sent to that other county, as pointed out in the clip there. And so I said, guys, I didn't bring my tools. I didn't bring my osteometric board, but I'll do the best I can. And so luckily, all of his bones were there. And we were able to ascertain these things in the field on the fly, which is something that I don't recommend people do. But based on the name that we had on the ID, and based on the profile that we had of the individual, everything matched up in their database, and we only had two people that fit that description that we gave of the individual. And one was Henry Wilson, he had Alzheimer's, and it's a long, sad story. But I was just glad that we were able to identify him, give his family peace after so long. And put him to rest. He didn't get put to rest right away. The thing about DNA, I can tell you that they did not actually, as far as I know, and I left 2 years after that case, they did not go with DNA because DNA is too expensive. They actually went with comparative x-rays of an injury that Mr. Wilson had had to assist in identifying him. So, but we've had other cases that take long amounts of time to identify individuals because their remains are very fragmented. And so it's the job of the forensic anthropologist to go through and identify each fragmented bone. What bone is it in the body? And there's 206 on average bones in the human skeleton, right? And depending on preservation processes, how people decompose, how carnivores or how other things that, consume a body, if it's in the wild, in the elements, all those sorts of things affect what we call the taphonomic process of decomposition. All those things affect the actual bones and how we're able to identify the bones, and that takes time. It takes time to piece together an individual, or sometimes we can get that biological profile within 3 days to a week, but then it takes longer to match an individual with that biological profile. So this case was a fluke of 3 hours Because in other cases I've
Wow.
worked on, that has not been the case at all. So.
So go through me, if you will, or run through the process. So let's say you've been called to the site of a homicide, or maybe it hasn't even been identified as a homicide. There's a dead body of sorts, and that's all you know. And what are the sort of things you look for? Do you look for race or sex or manner of how it passed? What do you look for? And are you involved at all in the process of finding the potential perp or perpetrator, if you will?
No, we're not involved. We're not involved in any side of engaging with the perpetrator or finding the perpetrator. That's the job of the investigative detectives. That is not our job. Our job is solely to recover the individual and identify the individual. So the first thing we do when we get called out to a site, and we can get called out to a site or we can get called into the actual, I've been called into the morgue for postmortems as well. If we're called out to a site, we have to excavate the individual, and that's like an archaeological excavation. We draw a map, we create a grid. Every artifact or every piece of clothing, coins, whatever that we find with the individual are mapped to a map. Everything is removed very carefully, bagged and tagged according to size, and taken back to the lab where the individual is further cleaned and examined. And then from there, we lay out the skeleton based on the number of bones we have and in the anatomical position, which is literally like this, right? And then from there, we start to make the identification. So we will use features of the pelvis and the skull and the joints and the overall size and dimensions of the bone to assist us in determining the sex of the individual, the biological sex. We will use specific bones, including long bones, which are in the arms and the legs, if we have those, to help us estimate the height of the individual. We'll look at cranial features in the skulls. In the skull, we'll look at cranial features in the skull. So the joints of the skull, for example, as well as the joints of the body, the big joints, the backbone joints, all those things to assist us in aging the individual. We'll also look at something that's very critical. You have two bones that comprise, your pelvis, the ossicossae. They come together at an area that's called the pubic symphysis, that joint. So we look at the wear on that joint, which has been critical in assisting us in determining age as well. We look for identifying features of the individual. Does the individual have what we call hardware, medical hardware? Is there any evidence of any medical implants, anything like that? Do they have serial numbers on them? In the old days, sometimes it was hard to match a serial number with an individual because not all doctors entered things into a database. Now they do, so that makes identification much easier. We'll look for evidence of healed trauma. We'll look for fractures, those sorts of things that have healed. Now that's just in terms of the uniqueness of the individual. When it comes to cause of death, there are certain things that, depending upon the cause of death, some things leave their mark on the skeleton, some things do not leave their mark on the skeleton. So I'm sure you've all heard if a person is strangled or they hang themselves, there's a bone up here in your throat that sits on top of your voice box, to speak broadly, called the hyoid bone. That bone is fractured, but that bone can also be fractured in high impact trauma. I've seen individuals who've gotten bar fights in the 18th and 19th century that have healed bones like that from bar fights. So we look for other things. We have to know the difference between trauma before death and trauma after death to assist us. And we know that, for example, bone that is fresh with moisture still in it is a bit more pliable, to speak more broadly, than bone that is dry, where it breaks a certain way. So that helps us in assisting in determining perimortem and postmortem fractures. We can take that to a microscope. For gunshot wounds, we have to know the difference between entrance and exit wounds. For stab wounds, we have to know how they appear in the bone. That helps us reconstruct, how do I say this? That helps us reconstruct how the stabbing happened, how it occurred, all these sorts of things. And even with gunshot wounds, we can tell you where the entrance wound is, where the exit wound is, what gunshot came first, what gunshot came second based on the radiating fractures if it's in the skull. So it's a large number of things that we put together multiple lines of evidence to create the biological profile of an individual. So if you watch the show, like the show Bones, which was really popular for many years, she gives an exact cause, an exact age of death. That is impossible. Usually we give age ranges because timing varies in terms of the fusion of the joints of your skull, right? So younger adults tend to have open joints. Middle-aged adults can be anywhere from 30 to 45 years old, speaking broadly for our age ranges. Older adults can be anywhere from 50 to 65 years old. Our aging methods actually stop at 65, which is when life begins for some of us. So there are problematic issues. And then determining ancestry from the skeleton is also complicated and complex, especially in this day and time where we have so much diversity in our samples. And so our samples on the forensic side that represent that are not as broad as the whole pool of human diversity. So there's been recent discussion in the literature about how accurate or inaccurate our ability to assess ancestry is, and should we even be doing that if we're engaging with coroners who are engaging with family members, then let's have a conversation with family members about those sorts of things. So there's a whole ethical side that has come into forensic anthropology, like bioarchaeology, that has now sort of changed how we do and see things.
So
Does
one
that answer
thing
your
that
question?
Yes, absolutely. So one thing that fascinates me, and you can tell me if this is fact or fiction, because I'm only familiar with it from works of fiction, from television shows, movies, etc. For example, let's say the identity of the victim or the body cannot be determined. They don't know who this person is. Is it true, and is this done at all, where facial reconstruction, where an actual image taken from the skull or built up, if you will, from the skull is created to give a sort of reasonable facsimile and then put out to the public. So if somebody sees it, they go, "Oh my God, that's my Uncle George," or whatever. Is that actually done or is that pure fiction?
That's done, and it has been done historically. I now teach at the University of South Carolina, where I'm a full professor, and the individual who was the forensic anthropologist there before me, he utilized that in multiple, Ted Rathbun, he utilized that in many of the cases that he had worked on because he was kind of like the pseudo, if you will, forensic anthropology for the state, anthropologist for the state at the time. But yes, it is done. And today, with the aid of computer aided, and I don't like to use the term AI, but we can use computer CADs, AutoCADs, and things like that to assist us. But in the old days, it was casting the skull and putting markers on all the different, there are hundreds of points on a skull that we measure as anthropologists to understand diversity in the skeleton and to identify an individual. And so markers on all those hundreds of points that have a name, and then they tell us about muscle depth. And then from that, then we can recreate the face itself. Now, there is artist licensing in terms of the expression of the face and certain aspects, but at least it gives you, especially when it was really picked up in the late 70s through the early 80s into the 90s, it gives you sort of an insight into the likeliness of an individual. And I think Frank Bender, who was a great forensic artist, had a lot of success with that. I mean, his work was really famous.
It's so exciting. Believe it or not, as a graphic designer, when I went to school in Montreal for this, we had to study and do life drawing. And part of our studies encompassed knowing what lay beneath the surface. So if we're drawing somebody, we'd have to imagine in our mind's eye their skull. We'd have to imagine where their facial muscles are if we're just talking about the face, let alone the entire body. Because from what I remember, we have one muscle in our lower lip, two muscles or three. I forget. I think it's two in the lower lip, three in the upper, and so forth to make a more accurate representation with shadow, etc. So I just love that. I feel like there's a tie-in of knowing where muscles and sinews and all this is when building up the model. However, back in the day, I think they did use clay models and whatnot to assist in that process. But nowadays, as you say, there's AI, it's all computerized. It saves so much time and probably creates something just as good, if not better, than what would have been created back in the day. I want to talk at this point about the humanistic aspect, about um, Susan, my wife, brought this up some months ago about you and your work, and she said, "Oh my God," she said this almost tearfully. Carlina, and I'm going to become verklempt in a minute. Carlina allows victims or they now have a voice. They can now share their story in a way through you, speaking in very broad terms. And what I want to do, because this is kind of related, is you've given me another video, which is so important about, well, you guys will see in a minute. It's very important. Sometimes a person's humanity can be lost even before they're gone. Let's have a look and see at this video, if we will.
Hello, and welcome to our first live in-person event called The African Burial Ground, Lessons for the Morton Collection. My name is Deborah Thomas. I'm the R. Jean Brownlee Professor of Anthropology and the Director of the Center for Experimental Ethnography here at the University of Pennsylvania. We are fortunate tonight to be joined by the director of the Penn Museum and a number of illustrious colleagues and friends of mine, whom I will introduce in a moment. But before I start us off, I want to acknowledge that we are speaking from the historic lands of the Lenape peoples. I ask you to join me in honoring the past, present, and futures of the Lenape, whose cultures and customs have nurtured and continue to nurture this land. We are also in a space, as many of you know, that was central to the elaboration of scientific racism. Both the Penn Museum and the Department of Anthropology promoted the scientific justification of white supremacy, and research undertaken at the museum and in the department was used to legitimize slavery and later segregation. These are the long histories that haunt efforts to transform this and other institutions, and that create the conditions for lack of transparency and accountability, and that thwart both decolonizing and healing processes. But they're also the histories that mandate and propel new directions and repair-oriented relationship building, and these are some of the issues that we're going to speak about this evening.
The history of the University of Pennsylvania and its medical school history, particularly where Samuel Morton, how he was associated with that in the Morton collection, it really goes back to the Enlightenment, as you point out, Dr. Blakey. And while we have this one side of the Enlightenment happening over here, in medicine, there's a completely different narrative that's happening where science is being introduced to medicine now. And with the scientific method making its way into medicine, moving away from that humoral system and the balance of humors, there's this association with really tearing the identity of an individual, of a person, from their body. And the corpus, the actual body of a person, becomes all these sorts of things. What can I diagnose? What is this disease? And it's not a person anymore. And so during this time period, we also see a rise in terms of anatomy and medicine, because biological anthropology is really born out of anatomy and medicine. It is the bastard child, if I can say that, of anatomy and medicine. Essentially, that's where it comes from. And these anatomists now in the Enlightenment start collecting people, and they start collecting bits and parts of people, and they start putting them in museums, and they have their own anatomical closets in their own museums because of this desire to collect, this desire to categorize, this desire to have everything that's pathological under the sun, which really continues into the 20th century. And in Morton's case, we can go back and step back even before Martin. We can go back to William Shippen, who's the founder of the medical school here. And he, as I was saying before we started, he studied at Edinburgh, which was one of the premier institutions in Britain and the world at the time for learning medicine, where these behaviors were happening. He also studied with John Hunter, who's considered the father of modern surgery. And John Hunter was one of those surgeons who both he and his brother William, if you've heard of the Hunterian in London, both the Anatomical Museum as well as the Hunterian in Glasgow, Scotland, they collected people, they grave robbed people. They took bits and pieces of people after they operated on them if they died to see if that operation panned out. Was it something wrong that I did? So this belief about grave robbing, this belief about collecting, this belief about categorization, I believe that really it comes forward and it moves forward from Britain and from Europe and other places in Europe too, like Paris and later Germany, to the United States, and it's transported here. So it starts with Shippen. And then as we move forward in time, we see this intimate tie to the University of Pennsylvania, not only with Morton, but with Josiah Knott, who co-wrote with George Glidden, The Types of Mankind, which was a horribly, as you've talked about, again, in your publications and your work, again, a horribly racist book that you can read on Google Books if you're interested, that moves us forward to this concept of polygyny, but this idea of collecting people is something that just doesn't stop. I mean, I work with anatomical collections that were collected from the late 19th to the mid 20th century, and those beliefs about collecting and having those bodies to validate and quantify something, and using the same measurement points that Morton uses, which we still use in our discipline today to study variation. It's a nasty, sticky, entangled, complex thing, which is why we're here to discuss it. So. I agree. And before I forget, the Medical College of Virginia adverts popped in my head because I teach my students this. I think it was an advert for the college pamphlet in 1854. The ample bodies of the Negroes in our, or the bodies of the ample bodies of Negroes in our factories will provide ample clinical instruction for the medical student and access to diseases, and the Medical College of South Carolina was no different, now known as the Medical University of South Carolina. And we all know about the Medical College of Georgia. And so they had their own Chris Brown. I don't know if Chris Brown has come up in y'all's. Chris Baker, yeah, Chris Baker. They had their own Chris Baker, Grandison Harris, who was a slave who was used as their resurrection. But that's a whole different narrative. Getting back to where we were, I agree with you, Rachel, about Cobb as well in terms of why he established this collection. And so I work with three. I work with the Hammond Todd collection, which started in the late 19th century and stopped when T. Wingate Todd unexpectedly passed away in the late 1930s. And it has about 3,100 individuals that were collected, and I'll explain what collected means in a moment, from Cleveland, Ohio. And the Robert J. Terry collection, which was collected from the late 19th century into 67 when Mildred Trotter retired. And these are individuals that are coming from St. Louis, Missouri. When I started working with these collections, my interest was in the actual environmental impacts of what was happening to these individuals. And folks that had worked with, particularly with the Robert J. Terry and the Hammond Todd collection, these are collections that have created essentially everything in our discipline in terms of human identification. The things that forensic anthropologists use to assess age, to assess ancestry, which is even, that's a big mire today that forensic anthropologists are working with.
It was in the New York Times this morning.
Yeah. It's a big. So to determine height, to create all the sort of mathematical formulae that we use to create a biological profile of an individual, these two collections were utilized to do that. What struck me as odd is that no one had really talked about who the people in these collections were. These individuals, going back to that Enlightenment perspective that we still hold on to in science, severing the identity of a person from their body. This is what happened to these individuals in these collections. We know their names, we know who they were, we know where they came from, but they're still referred to by their accession numbers. And none of the scientists, I would say, past the original amassers and William Montague Cobb, who was the first to really sit down with the Hammond Todd collection and say, okay, who are these individuals? Where did they come from? Oh my gosh, a lot of the black folk in this collection, they're from the Great Migration. He was the first to do that. No one picked up on that. And I was like, was Cobb right? And going through, it's that same pattern. I see it both in the Hammond Todd collection and the Terry collection. So my drive all of a sudden became not only understanding who these folks were in this collection, but where they came from. How did they end up in this collection? What's the narrative of these collections from the actual amassers? And so, and it's taken me to this path of ethics and better sort of ethical engagement and understanding these individuals and working with these collections. Anatomical legislation states, and this is still on the books in most states today, it depends on how your medical school wants to deal with it, that the descendants of an individual, so the relatives, friends, they have a certain interval of time in which they can claim an individual's remains. So, for example, I think in the state of Ohio, it's 36 hours. 36 hours. 36 hours. I mean, you really got to know some people in 30. You got to find a cell phone with that person in 36 hours, right? And if you don't find, if no one claims the deceased individual in 36 hours, the body is presented to the anatomical board, and then the anatomical board of the state or the district, if we're talking about Washington, D.C., decides where that particular individual is going to go in terms of a medical school for dissection. So these are individuals that didn't say, hey, I want to be dissected. These were individuals that were so poor and so marginalized within the system that no one claimed their remains, and they ended up being non-consensually dissected by and anatomized by medical students. It just so happened that T. Wingate Todd, who was really the major master of the Hammond Todd collection, was interested in understanding variation as well as aging and the impact of aging and variation on the human skeleton. And so that's why his particular collection stands. He was also interested really in reading some of his letters and his writings, sort of an early biocultural approach alongside with Cobb. Absolutely. And so I think Cobb studied under T. Wingate Todd, and I think that there's that sort of synthesis of ideas that happens with those two gentlemen, because they are gentlemen for the time period. And certainly we know T. Wingate Todd wasn't a racist, right? We know that because he would take Monty Cobb, and I think you've written about this, Michael. He would take Monty Cobb into a place, and if they wouldn't serve Monty Cobb because Monty Cobb was a black man, fine, I'm not giving you my business. That's it.
Well, I don't know that story, but it's believable, you know.
And wow. So when I watched that, Carlina, which you so kindly provided to me, it added more. It added so much more. I mean, I was aware of the basic humanistic approach, the humanity involved in your career, in your multiple careers, really, giving names to the dearly departed, piecing together perhaps their story, their background, let alone how they passed, which in itself is so crucial, it's so important. A picture, a very vivid picture is painted of a human being and how they lived in a non-judgmental way, hopefully. But I was reminded by watching that video, and it's pretty much everywhere in North America and probably the rest of the world, prejudiced, biased, how even white people, I mean, oh, I don't know if I should get into this, but people judged me when I first moved out here onto the west coast of Canada, and not even knowing me, calling me all kinds of names when I don't consider myself white because I'm Jewish. Now, I might have opened up a whole can of worms, and we're not going to go there. But because I don't look like a typical West Coast person of Vancouver, Canada, it's like I had a lot of bullies, and I'm in my 30s, maybe early 40s. What are we in high school? So I get that. I never was bullied or bothered on the East Coast because in many cases I do look like a typical Jewish man, and so I kind of fit right into all of that, into multiple categories. Some people thought I was Spanish or Greek or Italian, and others knew, well, oh yeah, he's Jewish, whatever. So this was made a big deal of out here when I first moved out here. And I get that. I mean, it's nothing like comparing that to what Black people and now Hispanic people and other non-white, to use this awful phrase, people probably still go through in the States. My dad, who lived in New York City for more than 20 years, he said to me once, um, and he was really upset. He said, Black people, they're treated horribly, especially in the South. He meant the States. And I didn't believe that because I was young. And I thought, really, aren't we all just people? But apparently that's not so. So this is why it's so important what you do. It's so important giving a heart, a brain, a mind, an identity to these dearly departed who have been and probably still may be marginalized. Did you care to elaborate a little bit?
Yeah, so in my research program, because as a professor, I have to have a research program. So I do forensic work as for the community. My actual research program, which was elaborated in that video, thank you, is basically putting a voice back to individuals in anatomical collections, which are collections that were amassed and gathered um, from the poor, the marginalized. So basically, the individuals in these collections were either people of color, they were very, very poor, or they were in insane asylums and state hospitals. And no one claimed their remains when they died. So there are three different narratives that are encapsulated in that. That of the poor, marginalized, that's one. The Great Migration, because most of my African Americans in these collections they are the bodies of Black brethren from the South who came to work in Cleveland, Ohio, or St. Louis during the Great Migration. They were actually recruited by Northern industry to work or used as strike breakers. That's another layer. And then the third narrative is that of the institutionalized. These are the elderly poor or the those with mental health issues that were put in state asylums and basically disappeared and forgotten about. These are the individuals in these collections. These individuals were the most marginalized individuals in their respective societies at the time. And the things that I see and those individuals, I still see today. The same stories about infectious diseases amongst my African Americans. The same stories about for institutionalized, especially institutionalized women, then as well as today, in terms of the things that happen to them in terms of trauma within institutions and how they die from those things, from poor access to poor healthcare or access to improperly not I shouldn't even say access, but improperly trained attendants. We did a study looking at assisted living facilities today and the institutionalized today, comparing it to the individuals that I had studied in these collections who were institutionalized in state institutions from the 1900s, from 1900 to 1964, in terms of fracture patterns and things like they were almost identical. It was hip fractures that were killing them, and hip fractures that could have been preventable. That it wasn't the result of, oh, she broke her hip, then fell. It was the result of actual trauma or poor infrastructure within the institution or the abuse of attendants that resulted and these hip fractures that then killed these ladies and caused their deaths. Same thing in assisted living facilities and public funded nursing homes today. So those patterns still exist. And I think for me, the biggest takeaway point, and one of the reasons why I continue to do this work, and I will die doing this work for me, is that, and I've said it before in publication, and I always say it. On my mom's side, I come from a Black family from Alabama. Prior to that, we had been enslaved in North Carolina. My granny, who raised me the first 5 years of my life, when she was a young lady during the era of the Great Migration, came up here to Chicago to train to be an official nurse. Prior to that, she had worked as a Black healer in the community. Had she died up here in Chicago, there was no way that they were going to find relatives within 36 hours. No way at that time period. So for me, it's a very real reminder when I see the bodies, the skeletons of these Black individuals, especially in the Hammond Todd collection, the Cleveland collection, that are from Alabama, who could possibly be some of my brethren. There by the grace of God goes me, as we say. It's a very real reminder for me of what could have happened to my granny. And so I remember that, and that's what drives me and keeps me going with this work, is giving those individuals their voice back. Because at the end of the day, they deserve, at the very minimal, that. These individuals have been handled, they have created, their bodies have created our discipline. They've created the methods, all the methods I told you about at the beginning of this discussion about how we identify a skeleton, a deceased individual, came from their bones. And for years, we didn't know who these people were. Well, they knew who these people were. I mean, it's in their folders and files, but I don't know what happened along the way. Scholars just forgot that, severing that individual from their bones. They became objects of scientific consumption, is what we say in the discipline. So the very least I could do, because these individuals have literally achieved what we all want to achieve, immortality, when you think about it, right, is to rehumanize them, to put their stories out there of how they ended up in these collections, give them the justice that they deserve. They wouldn't have wanted this in. That's not me. They wouldn't have wanted this in, but honoring them in the
I'd like
end
to start answering a
and
list of all the patients who were here during this unruly stay.
honoring them in the end and providing them with that justice that they
Confidentiality, you
deserve.
understand?
Awesome. Awesome. Thank you so much, Carlina, for the incredible and important, rather crucial work that you do. And let's say folks want to carry on or continue the conversation with you. How can they reach you?
Oh, you can find me on Facebook. You can find me on my faculty website, which is at the University of South Carolina. You can just Google my name. It's in there. You can find me on Instagram. I forgot what my handle is on Instagram. I don't remember. So, you can find me on Twitter, Blue Sky. I'm pretty easy to get a hold of. I'm not, I mean, it's not hard to find me.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Carlina de la Cova, for joining us this day. And hopefully we'll see you again really soon.
And thank you for having me.
Thank you, Carlina. I'm so excited that Carlina agreed to come on the show and share the important work she does. I want to share with all of you a little bit of what we have coming up. Um, we will start with Tommy Burnett's tome, Beneath the Surface. It's out now. According to him, real methods, real meaning, real impact. Excuse me. It's available from Amazon, but really, maybe he'll autograph one for you if you order it directly from him. And you can from his magictaboo.com site. That's magictaboo.com. And tomorrow, which is July 20th, Sunday, It's Tommy Burnett's Breaking the Veil, a mysterious demonstration of the weird and bizarre. It has magic, mystery, mayhem, and other creepy weirdness. You can, and it's only $15 per household on Zoom. So if you want to pick up tickets, you can just go to ticketsource.us/Tommy Burnett Productions. And it's really going to be worthwhile. So I highly recommend it. I'll be there, probably most of the people who are here tonight and the ones involved with open mic and all the other shows as well. And speaking of open mic magic, that's something you want to catch every Wednesday on Facebook, Open Mic Magic Theater. It has some of the best magicians in the world from all over the world, from the UK, some from Italy, even Canada, the US, and it's free for all of you. Every Wednesday at 1 p.m. West Coast time in North America, 4 p.m. East Coast time, also in North America, 9 p.m. UK time. And I promise, Joe, we will get the Australian time for you as well for everyone to watch. That's every Wednesday. My first erotic gothic horror novel, Blood Relations, is almost out. It's had a soft opening, pun intended, but we're going to go official full guns towards the end of August, featuring a podcast and webcast, etc. as well. So look for that. Get your advanced reader copies as well. If you're a fan of Facebook, go to my Facebook page, which is magic, MAJICK dot Likey. And under my name, you'll find somewhere Blood Relations, the page, and sign up for it. You can get your advanced reader copies or your ARC copy directly from me as well, so you can review it and see if it's your cup of tea. It isn't everyone's cup of tea. However, it would sure be great if you had a look at least. Friday, August 1st is my Friday Night Wizard Emporium. We've confirmed the great Michael Kelly, Donovan, Ari Rose, John the Great, myself, and Cheryl, who's conspicuously missing in action today. We are Strange Gambits. Peter John, Robina the Enchantress, Tommy Burnett, and Kevin Peel, Friday, August 1st. Again, tickets are free. It live streams to Facebook, same time as this show and most of the other really good shows, such as Open Mic Magic, 1 p.m. LA time, 4 p.m. New York time, 9 p.m. UK time. I think we've just about run out of time. I want everybody to make sure that they do catch myself and Cheryl and a great host of other people who are in our studio audience will be on the Wednesday show. So that's about it. I want to thank all of you for joining us this day, and we'll see you all again next time.